Coming Up for Air by George Orwell, book review. So I've decided some time ago that George Orwell is, I think, my favorite author of all time, which I suppose makes it a little bit puzzling that I haven't read more by him. I mean, he only published a handful of books before he died. But if I had applied myself, I could easily have read everything he'd written years ago. But I figure, why rush it? You know, when you find an author you really enjoy, it's sometimes best to savor it. So I've been reading a book of his every few years, maybe. Enjoying it, and then kind of leaving it alone, and then coming back. I'm getting to the point now where I've read most of them. I think there are two ones I haven't read yet: The Road to Wigan Pier and The Clergyman's Daughter. Other than that, I've read 1984 and Animal Farm, of course, a collection of his essays, Burmese Days, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, Down and Out in Paris and London. Yeah, I think that's all of them. And then just now, Coming Up for Air, which I found at a used book sale here in Saigon. Yeah, and then here I am with my review. Now, advance warning, there is a lot in here, like there's a lot of themes. So I'm probably just going to ramble on for a long time, and odds are I'm going to get cut off at 30 minutes because this camera just automatically turns itself off at 30 minutes. And probably I'm going to get cut off mid-sentence somewhere, but that's okay. Hopefully I'll be able to express a lot of my thoughts during that 30 minutes, and then if I happen to get cut off mid-sentence at the end of it, that's all right. I will have rambled on long enough by that point. Okay, right. So first off, as always, Orwell is just a pleasure to read. He's my favorite author, I think. In part because the prose just flows. He can describe stuff in a way that's very readable. And kind of right from the beginning, he's describing the main character. It's first-person narration. So, it's I, me, that kind of stuff. I didn't actually realize until I was a few pages in that it wasn't actually autobiographical. Because, some of his stuff is. Like a number of his essays are autobiographical, Down and Out in Paris and London are autobiographical. So I was just reading kind of these I was trying to shave, etc. And I thought this is, a personal story. But you get a couple pages in and you realize that this is actually a conceit. Like it's a first-person narration, but it's actually not Orwell himself. It's a fictional narrator whose name is also George, but George Bowling, who is a 45 fat insurance salesman with false teeth. And then the rest of the story is kind of told through his eyes. But there's so much personal detail in here that you suspect it's autobiographical. And then sure enough, kind of going over to Wikipedia confirms largely what you suspected. I mean, not all of it, of course. I don't think George Orwell himself was ever an insurance salesman. But certainly a lot of the childhood details and kind of the talk about kind of pre-war England and kind of growing up in the countryside is based on Orwell's experience. Now, Orwell, I don't actually know his biography in detail. Like, I think he was born kind of out in India or something, but he and his family made frequent trips back to England. So these kind of reminiscence about kind of the pre-World War I English summertime in the country kind of come from his his real memories. Right, where to begin with this? Oh, I guess I'm talking about the framing device, the narration. I was reading on Wikipedia that some critics have criticized Orwell's choice to tell the story through kind of a middle-brow insurance salesman. Because they say that the thoughts that this character is having are not really typical of that character. They're just kind of Orwell's thoughts himself. Orwell does try and get around this by talking about how this character, even though he's an insurance salesman, was very literary. He spent kind of his youth reading adventure stories and just kind of whatever, much like Orwell himself did. And then he spent a year kind of in the army where he got stationed out in the middle of nowhere and just kind of filled his time by kind of reading and kind of got his literary education that way. So yeah, I think that works. And you know, it's probably a bit kind of classist, right? To say like, because he's a middle-class insurance agent, he can't possibly have these kind of highbrow thoughts. It is, yeah, I guess the difficulty is there are definitely passages in this book where you feel very strongly as the reader that this is Orwell's views himself kind of coming through. And I guess this is a problem with any first-person narration fiction book, is separating the narrator from the author. Like, how much of the views expressed in this book are Orwell's himself, and how much of them are the fictional narrator. But you certainly feel like there's an authenticity to these views, which seem to be coming from Orwell himself and not the narrator. So I guess in that respect, kind of separating what's really authentically Orwell's views and kind of what he's putting in his narrator's mouth is a bit of a trick. I'm gonna largely assume they're kind of all Orwell's views. Certainly, most of them you feel are Orwell's views. The character is right. The character is a bit fat, and that's something that kind of comes up frequently in the narration. And I don't think Orwell was ever fat during his life, although I don't know. You know, maybe he got fat near the end, or when he hit 40, like a lot of us do. But yeah, there's a lot of serious themes going on in this book: fascism, democracy, the loss of innocence, stuff like that. But there's also a lot of humor infused throughout it. So it's kind of at times a depressing book to read, but there's also some funny parts throughout. One of the things that keeps coming up is, I guess Orwell gets a lot of mileage out of the character being fat, which is maybe a bit of a cheap shot, but Orwell is kind of acknowledging this throughout the book. You know, the character himself talks about how since he's fat, he can't really do drama. Like he says, you know, he was reading this book where there was this man whose lover had left him, so he collapsed into a fit of weeping. And he said, you know, that guy could get away with it because he was thin. Me as a fat man, I could never collapse into a fit of weeping because a lover had left me. He's like, you know, people just laugh at a fat man. They're meant for kind of broad comedy, and people kind of assume you have no feelings, but you couldn't just collapse weeping like that. And sorry, I'm not describing it well, as usual, but it's funny in the book. The character talks about, like, just imagine the scene, and he kind of creates a scene of a fat man like him collapsing weeping and talking about how ridiculous it is. It's funny when you read it. And there's a lot of kind of stuff like that mixed throughout the book. Excuse me. This book was published in 1939, so before 1984. 1984, I think, was published in 1948. And there are a lot of ideas in this book which will later pop up in 1984. Just kind of reading from the back cover, a critic called John Carey said 1984 is here in embryo. So, the ideas that will pop up in 1984 are beginning to germinate here. Well, I'm talking about the narrator. Kind of one of the things that's similar to 1984 is the idea of a middle-aged man, he's 45 in this book, whose body is just beginning to kind of fall apart on him. I mean, you remember maybe from 1984, that character Winston, he was in his 40s, and his body was just a wreck. This is a character who's in his 40s, who's still kind of feeling like he's got some life left in him, but also feeling like he's not. I guess this thing you go through in your 40s, where one minute you feel like entirely youthful, and then one minute you feel like an old man. I just turned 40 myself, so I'm beginning to feel that myself. I get the impression, reading Orwell's books, that his body kind of started to fall apart on him earlier than most. Or I don't know, maybe it was common at the time. I also get the impression, reading Orwell's books, that he probably smoked too much and drank too much, and maybe that took an early toll on his body. I don't know. Like Winston in 1984 was only in his 40s, but his body was just falling apart. All this coughing and wheezing, and how he couldn't touch his toes during the exercise and stuff like that. Yeah, this character isn't quite that bad, but it's kind of the same thing. He's got false teeth already by his mid-40s. He's a bit fat, but otherwise fairly healthy. I don't know. Anyways, right. Okay, so talking about some of the themes in this book, I guess there's a few different things going on. So we'll have to talk about some different themes, but one of the big ones is the upcoming war with Germany. So this book was published in 1939, so a couple of years before the war started. But boy, it's amazing how clearly Orwell sees the war coming already. Now, I guess during those years in England, probably everyone could see it coming clearly. At least that's the impression you get reading this book. The narrator says several times, everybody knows, everybody can see it, everybody knows that within a year we'll be at war. So, I guess at that time, maybe everybody could see it. And this book actually kind of hit the publishing stands before the war, but then the war broke out very shortly after that, and according to the publisher's introduction, the war kind of killed the sales of this book, and it didn't really get kind of new life until after the war. But yeah, he talks about how you hear the planes going overhead, and everybody knows that within a year these planes will be dropping bombs. Or not these planes, but it'll be German planes going overhead. It's very much on the character's mind that England is going to be bombed in the very near future. And he's imagining, the air raid shelters and the children in gas masks, and the buildings getting blown up. He's on the train, and he's kind of looking out from the train in London, and he just kind of sees the rows of houses going on forever. And he just imagines, what bombs will do to these rows. It's so target rich. I mean, assuming your target is just people or houses. And, it's an interesting glimpse into what people were thinking right before the war. And there's some dark humor mixed in with this as well. Again, one of the pleasures of reading Orwell is he's always kind of critiquing other writers. And I'm assuming this is a real critique, although who knows, maybe he made it up. But at one point, his narrator is mentioning stuff that he's been reading in the newspapers. Like, the newspapers are saying, he says, you know the war is coming for sure. He's like, you've got to be so sure it's coming because everyone's writing in the newspapers telling you not to worry. and that's a sure sign that we're definitely headed towards war. And apparently one of the things that people were writing in the newspapers was, don't worry about these bombers. The anti-aircraft guns are so effective that the planes are going to have to fly so high up that we won't have to worry about the bombs. And then Orwell's narrator says, now notice, this guy thinks that if the planes are high enough, the bombs won't touch the ground. And that's just classic Orwell, the way he's kind of making fun of other writers. But, you know, it's kind of darkly humorous, but it's humorous the way Orwell is just kind of mocking their arguments. And then Orwell says, of course, or the narrator says, of course what he means is that the bombs won't hit their intended target. They won't actually hit the arsenal. They'll just probably land in the poor neighborhoods instead, where who cares about it? And he's probably right. That probably is what the newspaper writers were thinking at the back of their minds. So yeah, those kind of things are very interesting. It's also interesting, yeah, the people's attitudes gearing up towards this war. Now, something that I kind of read sometimes is people saying, you know, why weren't people more outraged about Hitler before the war started? Or why didn't people care about what was happening to Jews in Germany before the war started? And I'm not an expert on this, and it's quite possible that people didn't care enough. But reading this book, which again was published in 1939 before the war started, you do get the impression that the atrocities in Germany were big news and that they were on the forefront of people's minds. And Orwell does talk about how people are getting worked up about what's going on in Germany and getting worked up about the Jews. Now there's a passage in this book, again kind of one of the more political parts, where Orwell's character goes to a meeting of the Left Book Club. Now the Left Book Club is something I'm vaguely familiar with because it's shown up in a lot of Orwell's other essays. Orwell, I don't know exactly what his relationship with the Left Book Club was. On the one hand, he was kind of an ally of the Left Book Club because I believe they did kind of sponsor a number of his books. On the other hand, he did definitely butt heads with them at a few stages. And this kind of comes out in some of his essays. He talks about some of the idiocies of the Left Book Club. Now, the Left Book Club, if you look them up on Wikipedia, which I did, they were kind of a big thing in their day, kind of from 1930s to 1940s. As the name implies, they were kind of a book club, kind of filled up by leftists, who would kind of sponsor a lot of leftist literary projects. And apparently were influential at one time, although they've since gone out, faded into obscurity. Yeah, I shouldn't say that. According to Wikipedia, it was a paper shortage in kind of World War II and stuff like that that killed them. They didn't fade away. Anyways, they were quite influential at one time. And the narrator's wife, this is where some of the humor comes into the book again. The narrator's wife is part of a group of women who are always trying to get things for free. Arguably, Orwell's portrayal of women is a little misogynist. This is something that's come up a bit in some of his books. He portrays his wife as just kind of a shrew and a harpy who's always kind of giving him trouble. And she and kind of a group of female friends are always trying to, you know, be miserly and get things for free. And so they join up for the Left Book Club just because they can get some free books out of it, apparently, and kind of go to lectures out of it. And yeah, Orwell, they're going to an anti-fascist lecture. And Orwell, the main character, I keep saying Orwell, but it is a fictional book. So the character in here, whose name is George Bowling, kind of goes along with them. It paints a picture of this lecture where half of the people there don't know why they're there. They're just going because it's like a free lecture that's on. And maybe that was true of these kind of lectures at that time. It probably is still true of these kind of lectures. And then half of the people there are really political and are really into it. So they go to a lecture by a famous anti-fascist who's giving a speech against fascism in Germany. And this guy is getting real worked up and, talking about how it's a crime against humanity and Europe's going back to the Dark Ages and it's so barbaric, all the things that are happening in Germany. Which again kind of indicates that at least some people were very worked up about it at the time, even though you do read sometimes editorials that people didn't care enough about it. Orwell does paint a picture of at least a certain segment of English society being very worked up about the fascism. What's kind of interesting, what surprised me a little bit, is Orwell's narrator, and I'm assuming Orwell himself, is taking a very cynical view of the whole thing. So the guy is giving his speech, and Orwell's narrator is kind of thinking about it. And Orwell's narrator is thinking how ridiculous it is that this guy is a well-known anti-fascist. I mean, what kind of job is that? What did he do before fascism came about? Like, what's he going to do after fascism fades away? Like, it just kind of mocking the idea of being a professional anti-fascist. Orwell also, or his narrator again, is thinking, he's noticing that when this guy is giving his anti-fascist speech, he's just falling into a rhythm where the same predictable phrases are coming out over and over again, like fascism, democracy, fascism, democracy. We must stand for democracy, we must fight against fascism. And Orwell's narrator is also thinking that the idea of this meeting is not really to bring forth any fresh ideas. It's kind of all the old slogans all over again. What the idea of this meeting is to get everyone worked up into kind of 2 minutes hate against a fascist, where you're supposed to, he identifies it with a type of xenophobia. You're supposed to hate the foreigners, and in this case, the foreigners you're supposed to hate are the fascists. But it's closely tied in with the idea of hating the foreigners and kind of getting everyone all worked up about it. Now, all of these ideas are stuff that's going to pop up in 1984 again. The idea of the empty slogan, the idea of the 2 minutes hate, the idea of kind of getting people all riled up against a certain group, the idea of these kind of duck-like men who kind of talk in this kind of rhythm when they're kind of getting the slogans out. But, yeah. And there is half a point there, I mean, probably. It's interesting, though, because in Orwell's essays, you get the sense that Orwell very much supported the war effort and was very much kind of for the war against fascism. And, of course, not forgetting, of course, that Orwell himself went to fight against fascism in Spain. So here again, I guess, is a question where it's a little bit difficult to separate the narrator from the fictional character. Sorry, the fictional narrator from the real-life author. But yeah, you, in spite of what Orwell has written elsewhere, and in spite of kind of what we know about him as being somebody who was very much for the fight against fascism, and I think, famously Orwell has wrote essays during World War II saying, this is no time for pacifism. We need to fight the Nazis. In spite of all that, in this book, he gives a very kind of cynical view of people who are against fascism and kind of attend these meetings. I don't know. Make of that what you will, or kind of reconcile it how you will. It's interesting. And then after the meeting, Orwell kind of meets up with some young communists he knows who are very kind of big on the anti-fascist thing and talk about going to war. And his narrator, sorry, I'm mixing up the narrator and Orwell again. It's difficult with a book like this to separate the fictional narrator from the author. But his narrator kind of talks to these young men, and they say, you know, we've got to go and fight them. Doesn't it just make your blood boil to hear what they're doing in Germany now? And Orwell's narrator said, you know, my blood was boiling during World War I. He doesn't call it World War I, of course, because this was 1939, so this was just the war. Yeah, he said, my blood was boiling back in 1914, but he said a few weeks in the trenches will take the boil out of your blood pretty quickly. He said, I learned, you will learn too, as soon as you know what a trench smells like. And it says, once you're in the trenches, you don't care about any of it anymore. You don't care about the heroic Belgians or what's going on in Germany or any of it. You're just kind of in the trenches and trying to survive at that point. And again, his narrator gives advice to these young men. Stay out of it. You know, if the war is coming, you stay out of it. And he knows they won't listen to him. At the same time, Orwell's narrator is convinced that Hitler and Stalin are something completely new, that the world has kind of never seen these before. And then immediately afterwards, there's an interesting passage where he goes and has a discussion with an old classicist friend of his. Classicist in the schoolboy sense, meaning somebody who's really into ancient Roman Greece. And the narrator is convinced that Stalin and Hitler are something new and the world is changing. And his classicist friend says, no, there's nothing new under the sun. This has all been done before. We had tyrants just like Hitler in ancient Greece. And he kind of reads a passage from a book about ancient Greece, which describes a tyrant who had been just like Hitler. And it's an interesting question, kind of whether Hitler and Stalin are something completely new or whether this is just kind of a reiteration of kind of the old tyrants that have always been throughout history. But Orwell's narrator, and presumably Orwell himself, is completely convinced that this is something new. And he says, you know, I'm not a genius, but I can see this coming so clearly. He says, I can see it so clearly. War is coming, the bombs, the barbed wire, and then afterwards there's going to be the secret police and the rubber truncheon and the slogans and the propaganda. He says, I can see it so clearly that it's coming, and afterwards it's never going to be the same ever again. Which is an interesting prophecy. Certainly he was right about the war coming, although again, it sounds like everybody knew that the war was coming. But then, was he right about the world never being the same ever again? This kind of sense that after the war, we're going to go into this police state and we're never going to get out of it. Or he doesn't actually use the word police state, but this idea of slogans and propaganda and stuff like that. I guess this is that age-old debate that people always have about Orwell's vision of the future. Was he right or not? I mean, or how right was he? Are we living in a police state now? Or was Orwell totally wrong and we've kind of gone into this new age of freedom and democracy and information? And again, I don't want to get bogged down in this debate, although it's worthwhile to have. Because, you can go round and round in circles depending on how you pick your examples or what examples you pick. On the one hand, obviously here I am on YouTube. Nobody's censoring me yet, giving my complete, free to give my complete opinion about whatever I think about this particular book. On the other hand, you could make the argument maybe that we did kind of go into an age of surveillance and politicization after World War II that we never really recovered from. I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to say really, because everyone who's kind of alive